Join me in Matthew 28. You'll go there in your Bible. I want to grab a little episode here at the end of Matthew's Gospel and toward the end of his record of Jesus' story, and then tie that in with what is the plan to talk about tonight. So I'm going to pick up at verse 11. Will you look there? Matthew 28, verse 11. It says, "Now, while they were on their way, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priest all that had happened. When they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'You are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this should come to the governor's ears, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble.' And they took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day." So this little snippet from Matthew's account brings us to arguably what is the most important location in Jerusalem. Maybe it'd be better to say the most important location on the whole planet. To the door of Jesus' empty tomb. It is not possible to exaggerate the importance of whatever it was that happened here. For me and you as disciples, everything is riding on this. So if you'll jump ahead to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, let me just ask you to note that Paul really puts us on the line. His language is unmistakable. If you go down to verse number 12, as he talks in this chapter about the resurrection, he says in verse 12, "Now if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead," which is what they preached and what we preach, "how do some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised," listen to this, "our preaching is vain. And your faith is vain. And what is said of these disciples is true for me and you. Everything hinges on whatever it was that happened at the empty tomb. It is the critical moment in the story." I think that critics of Christianity understand this as well as we do. And so, as a consequence of that, all down throughout time, at the door of this tomb, there has been a battle waged over what happened there. And all kinds of stories, starting with the one we read in Matthew 28. I guess that was the first attempt to deal with the problem of the resurrection. But make no mistake, down through history, stories have continued to be told about what happened here. Critics say he wasn't buried at all. The fate of his body was the fate of what would have been any common criminal at the day. They found a pit, they threw in the bodies and covered them over, and the body of Jesus was lost forever. There was no resurrection. My favorite one is the story that said he didn't really die. That he just sort of fainted, passed out on the cross, and the people who were there, who were obviously backward and knew nothing about life and death, looked at him and thought, well, he looks dead. And so they took him down and they put him in the grave. And as he got laid out in the cool of the tomb, that sort of revived him. And so he got up and he walked out and he appeared to his disciples, and they thought he had been raised from the dead. And there you go. There's the story. He never really died anyway. Some people, oddly enough, continue the story That was the lie told by the authorities all the way back then. The disciples just stole his body. They just came and took him away. Or some people say, they just went to the wrong tomb. I mean, lots of tombs in Jerusalem, and they got confused, and they went to the wrong tomb, which, lo and behold, also happened to be empty. And so they began running around telling everybody that he had been raised, when really they got mixed up about where he was buried. Let me tell you the curious thing about that. There is not an ounce of historical evidence for any of those theories. For the most part, those theories are literally pulled out of thin air. But listen, they got to have something. Because this is well, I can't even see it. Y'all need to trim your trees. That slide back there, y'all can see it, right? Well, that one works too. I've got a tree problem on this side too, though. They got to have some kind of story for what happened here. It has always been the challenge for critics of Christianity. What do we do? Something happened here. And so we've got to come up with some kind of story to account for. However, it is not enough for me and you as Christians to criticize the critics. In fact, we are the ones who are making the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead. And so the question for me and you is, how do we know that's true? I mean, beyond the fact that probably many of you, like me, grew up going to church. Don and I are old enough that we remember flannel graph in Bible class of the empty tomb and the little rolling rock in front of the door. I mean, we had the whole thing, right? Don't you miss flannel graph? Those were the good old days. We've been taught this our whole lives. But in a growingly unbelieving culture, it isn't enough to just say, I learned it from the flannel graph. I don't think that's going to be convincing. How do we know that Jesus rose from the dead? Now, that's a quarter of Bible classes. 6 hours probably to adequately touch all the bases, and I've got probably 35 minutes left. I say that because there are so many facets of the case for the resurrection to be covered that you don't want to stay here that long. Even if they were serving coffee, you wouldn't want to stay here that long to cover all of this. So I hopped on Amazon as I was prepping for this, and I typed in the resurrection of Jesus. I got 6,000 hits. I'm assuming some of that may be redundancy, but needless to say, there have been thousands of volumes written about the resurrection of Jesus, and we've got 30 minutes. So what I'd like to do is to just make this real simple. In fact, as I put this together, I just thought about the kind of conversations that you and I would have, not with some PhD teaching theology at a local university, but someone you're talking to at work who wonders about this. And make no mistake, brothers and sisters, in our world today, increasingly people wonder about the basic stuff. So I'm having a conversation with a coworker, and we need to talk about this. What can I say to them? How do I know Jesus rose from the dead? Let me give you 3 answers to that question. The first answer I would give is this. I know that he was risen from the dead because he died and he was seen again. That would be enough, wouldn't it? If Jesus was alive and then people watched him die and then saw him alive again, then we would have an unimpeachable case that he rose from the dead, right? And so that would be my argument, that people saw him die and he rose again. It's interesting to me. Let's kind of unpack that a little bit. Let's start with the fact that he died. It's interesting to me that there are actually people who dispute that. Because nobody on scene said that. Okay? That wasn't the argument of the Jews. Let's just say he didn't really die. Nobody offered that as a possibility. And yet modern day critics, so far removed from the actual events, that's actually something that they claim. Isn't it interesting that we know so much about the death of Jesus? Have you ever thought about that? And not just historical records that say he died on the cross, but I mean detailed accounts of how he died. Have you ever thought about how much detail there is? For example, we know about the scourging, which was literally a beating that required a witness to pass judgment on how close the victim was to death. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for someone to die from the scourging because it would go too far. They were literally beaten to within an inch of their life. So Jesus endured the scourging. Then he was taken to the cross to be executed. And I would just suggest, folks, that historically, not just biblically speaking, but historically speaking, the Romans were notorious for being very, very good at this. They knew how to kill people by crucifixion. And then there's that other detail. Remember the detail about the spear being shoved up in his side? And we're even told what comes out. Blood and water flow. Some think the pericardium of the heart was punctured. I don't know if that's true or not, but would have caused water-like fluid to come out. So if that were so, we'd actually have evidence of the spear being shoved all the way up into his side, even maybe piercing his heart. What's even more interesting to me is that there's actually an official inquiry into whether or not he's dead. If you'll go back to Mark's account, in Mark chapter 15. So in Mark 15, in verse 43, Joseph of Arimathea comes to take down his body and to see to his burial. Look at 44. Pilate wondered if he was dead by this time. So appreciate that the question came up in the moment on the scene. Pilate wanted to know, well, before I turn over his body to you, is he really dead? I need to know that. And so, summoning the centurion, he questioned him as to whether or not he was already dead. So I want you to think about this. Pilate asked the question. He calls someone who is there at the cross witnessing the execution, experts at doing this, and he said, I need to know if Jesus is really dead. And so in verse 45, and ascertaining this from the centurion, he granted the body of Joseph. So isn't it curious? It's almost like the Lord anticipates some nut would come along and say something like this. He really didn't die. And there is an official record of an official inquiry into the deadness of Jesus. And the record is that he died on the cross. It's important for me to throw in at this point. We keep appealing to the gospel accounts. You will understand that we don't assume those accounts are reliable. In fact, just forget this evening the fact that they're inspired. We could set that aside for a moment. All we need to know to make the case for the resurrection is that they are historically accurate. So that's another whole line of study. Okay? I'm going to throw that in Don's lap. He can talk to you about that at another time. Because we could spend hours tonight going into the details of how you know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John got the story right. I'll touch on that just a tad, but that's another whole line of evidence to consider. And I'm telling you, the evidence is compelling that you could trust what these guys said. And what they tell us is that Jesus died on the cross. And then, as the other half of that he was seen alive again. In fact, post-resurrection, that was the story of New Testament preaching. That Jesus died and rose again, and there was abundant witness to that event. So, make your way over to Acts 2. Let's notice how that's front and center in the gospel story. This is Acts 2, this is Pentecost. And Peter is delivering the sermon. Right down to verse 22. Where he says, Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst. Look at this. Just as you yourselves know. Can I just pause and ask you? I have that one underlined in red in my Bible. Just as you yourselves know. I want you to think about it. In fact, he's preaching to an audience responsible for the death of Jesus. You see that? And he says to this audience, you know, Jesus came as a miracle worker. And you all know that. You saw it. Folks, he couldn't get away with saying that if it weren't true. These people knew who Jesus was. There was no denying that he had been a miracle worker. Verse 23, this man delivered over by the predetermined plan of foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. But God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. Then verse 32, this Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Now look, put the pieces together. Jesus came. You killed him. God raised him. And lots of people saw him after he was raised. That was the New Testament passage. Now, if you'll go back to 1 Corinthians, Paul is going to pick that up. He's going to say the same thing. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if you go back there, he's going to expound on this witness business. This is 1 Corinthians 15 and verse number 3. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scripture, and that he was buried, and that he was raised up on the third day, according to the Scriptures. You hear echoes of Acts 2 there, right? Same kind of sermon. Now look at verse 5. And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, as one untimely born, he appeared to me also. I want you to notice, the Holy Spirit goes to a lot of trouble to talk about this witness list. And the group of 500 are particularly interesting to me. 500, not individual appearances. He saw 500 people at one time, a large gathering. And Paul goes on to say, some of them have died, but most of them are still alive. Why do you think he said that? Why did he say, most of the people in that crowd of 500, they're still living? Because you can go and ask them. Give me a name. I want to talk to someone who saw him alive. Appreciate, brothers and sisters, resurrection was not this quiet little happening that occurred off in some dark corner, and a couple of these guys claim to have seen it, and then they go tell everybody, and that's how the story gets started. That is not what went down here. Jesus rose from the dead. He was risen from the dead. He was seen by lots of people. It was public. In fact, it is just difficult for me to imagine that the gospel story would be able to get legs at all unless there were people running around saying, yep, we saw that. Because that was the claim. He died, you killed him, God raised him from the dead, and he has been seen. How come anybody believed that story? Well, I'll tell you why. Because there were people who'd seen it. They were telling the story. The whole thing was public. And so, if these things are true, then what I think is we have an unassailable case for the resurrection. What happened to the door of the empty tomb? Jesus rose from the dead. How do we know that? Well, because people saw him killed. And then they saw him alive again. Now, I know that there will be some critics who are unhappy with that. And one of the arguments say, well, wait, is that we can't trust his guides, right? They're the ones telling the story. Their records or records their friends made are the records that we're reading when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so, we really can't trust these guys. Some believe that after Jesus' death, his followers were really disappointed. And it is true that they had not anticipated that this is how it would go, that he was going to die. That was a surprise to him. And so it's the belief of some critics that after his death, they're thinking, we got to do something to prop up our cause. We got to keep this thing going. And so what they do is they invent a resurrection myth that took hold, and people believed it, and now all these years later, you and I are believing the myth too. So, I wanted to mention that because it dovetails well with the next bit of evidence I want you guys to consider, and that is this. I think the change in his followers is evidence that he really rose from the dead. And I want you to think with me about that next. The change in his followers serves as evidence, I think compelling evidence, that he rose from the dead. I didn't always believe that. I remember the first time I read this argument. Look at the way his people changed. I thought, that's okay. I don't think that's a great argument. But I kept reading more about it, and I kept thinking about it. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, actually, this is a pretty good way to demonstrate that he rose from the dead. So I want you to think with me about that for a little while. Let me see if I can at least get you to stir your brain about it and think about it. The gospel writers give us a detailed picture of his followers around the time of his crucifixion and resurrection. Here's the thing I want you to know about that picture. It is ugly. What the Gospels say about Jesus' closest companions at the critical hour is terribly unflattering. Have you ever thought about that? Start with the crucifixion itself. Who set that up? What of his own did? Judas did. How embarrassing is it that this awful moment is caused by the contribution of one of his own? Do you know how we know that? Because one of the disciples wrote it down so that everyone would know. It was one of his own that betrayed him. Why is that in the story? Why not just leave that part out? Well, he got betrayed. Someone turned him in, he got arrested. Doesn't have to be there. You can tell the story without knowing. It was Judas. It was one of his own. That's in there. And then in John 14 and verse 50, when the time came for Jesus to be arrested, you remember what all the apostles eventually did, right? His closest guys. Peter, shortly before it had said, if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. When the authorities came, what they all did? I mean, we'd say in Texas, they scattered like cockroaches when you turn the light on, right? They were out of there. You know how we know that? Because one of the disciples wrote that down for everyone to read. And then there's Peter, Matthew 26 and verse 69. Wow. What a nasty story that is. After being the one to say, I will never deny you. 3 times, once he's arrested, when people say, no, you're one of them. We recognize you. Peter said, I don't know who he is. I do not know the man. And I'm not sure how that scene's set up, where the last time he did that, he's within eye shot of Jesus and they make eye contact. You think Peter was ever the same after that? And we know that because one of the disciples wrote it down. In fact, one of the curiosities I have about that is who would have known except for Peter and Jesus about the eye contact? I guess Peter shared the story. And someone wrote it down. And then after the crucifixion, we learned in John 20 and verse 19 that they're all hiding. They're locked away somewhere. They're afraid of the Jews. In fact, when the first reports come down that Jesus is raised from the dead, it's the apostles who don't believe it. They reject that testimony. In fact, Thomas is the greatest example of that. If ever there were a person who had a reason to believe the reports about the resurrection, it was Thomas. He was the last guy in line to find out about that. And so he had the benefit of his own fellow apostles coming and saying, he's risen. Not only had Jesus told him it would happen, but now the apostles are saying, yes, he's risen. We've seen him. And Thomas says what? I'm not believing it. Not until I see. I want to see his hands. I want to touch it. I want to know. Until then, I will not believe. And you know how we know that happened? Because somebody shared that story and wrote it down for everyone to consider. So why is all that important? A couple of reasons. Number one, I think what it tells us is these are not guys trying to prop up a movement. Do you see that? Again, critics just pull that out of thin air. There's no historical evidence of that. All the historical evidence we have says these guys were like sheep without a shepherd. In fact, that's what they were. No compass, no idea where to go, no idea what to do next. This is not the way it was supposed to go down, and they are just dazed and confused. Again, they don't even believe the first report. And then secondly, the fact that the accounts are so terribly unflattering, I think suggests powerfully that they must have been honest. Why else would such unflattering detail have been included? Think about it. Critics of Christianity are saying, oh, the disciples just made up this story. They wanted to prop up their cause and keep it going now that they have a dead Messiah. So let's invent a resurrection story. They're inventing this resurrection story? Dude, if I was going to make up a story, if I was lying anyway, I would at least make myself look good. I would have said, oh, I knew he was going to rise. I knew it all along. Didn't worry me at all when I saw him go to the cross, because he had said, in 3 days, I will be raised up. In fact, I got up Sunday morning, I got up before sunup, and I was standing at the tomb applauding when the Lord came out. I was ready. Wouldn't you do that with you? And see, they didn't have to make up a lie. With a lot of this stuff, all they had to do was leave it out. I mean, if I'm Peter, I'm saying, Matthew, that part in chapter 26, I know there weren't chapters back then, but anyway, that part in chapter 26, could we just edit that out and leave that on the cutting room floor? Why do we need to include that ugly scene when I denied him? I would suggest when men create a fraud, this isn't how they do it. The unflattering nature of their testimony suggests that their testimony is true. Before the resurrection, these guys were a mess. But it didn't stay that way, did they? Now, think about what they became. And since we've been throwing Peter under the bus, why don't we just start with Peter? Think about what Peter became. From a guy who just a few days earlier said, I don't even know who he is. Go back to Acts 2. Remember that sermon on the day of Pentecost before a crowd of people, a huge crowd of people responsible for the death of Jesus? Remember that Peter is the one that's standing up there saying, this man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross, but God raised him up again. Verse 32, and we saw it. We are witnesses. Wow, that is a powerful message. Publicly charging this crowd with the death of Jesus. Where did that courage come from? Where's the cowardly Peter that denied him? This is not the same man. In fact, all of these men devoted their lives to the cause. And Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 3 what that was, going to the world and preaching that Jesus came and he was killed and he rose again, and lots of people saw that. I want you to appreciate, folks, that they got nothing from this. They weren't popular. In fact, they were hated. They didn't achieve power and status. In fact, they were outcast because of this testimony. Remember how Paul was laughed off, what was it, Mars Hill, for talking about the resurrection among the Gentile scholars of his day? It didn't make them wealthy. They wrote books that sold millions of copies. You're holding them tonight. And never saw a dime. What they did get was suffering, ridicule and slander. They were arrested and jailed. They were threatened and beaten. In fact, look over in the 2 Corinthians letter, because Paul gives us a pretty good summary of what his life was like because he preached the gospel. This is 2 Corinthians 11. Maybe you've heard this section before, starting down around verse 23, as he's dealing with some of his critics. He says, "Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so. In far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times from the Jews I received 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there is daily pressure on me. I'm concerned for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern?" There you go. There's your prize for teaching that Christ rose from the dead, and we saw him. Life of suffering. In fact, the truth is, folks, they almost all died for their testimony. Now, most of that is not biblical, it's historical. But if the history about this is even close to being right, with perhaps the exception of the Apostle John, they all died horrific deaths for one reason, because they wouldn't recant that Jesus Christ died and rose, and we saw him. So, from guys hiding out for fear of the Jews, to men who would die for that testimony, these guys changed. It's part of the historical record. And so it must be accounted for. I think critics would be pretty quick to dismiss all of that. I think they would just argue that people die all the time for causes that have no merit to it. And so maybe you've heard somebody talk about a terrorist who will strap explosives around his body and go into a diner or get on a bus, and he'll detonate his explosive and he'll kill a bunch of people and in the process take his own life. And they would point out that there's an example of somebody who is pointlessly choosing to die. Except to him it is not pointless. He believes that Allah will reward him greatly for this great act of heroism. And so that's why he does it. He believes in the cause, and he believes in the reward. And so he's willing even to cut his life short because of it. You can't say that about the apostles. Because if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, they knew. They would have been the ones who made up the story. They would know it was a myth. Folks, people may die for a lie, but people do not die for something they know is a lie. So you can't say that with these men. They went from frightened, hiding out, to bold proclaimers willing to die. Here was their reason. We watched him die. We saw him alive. I think that is compelling testimony that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. What time do I need to stop?
You've got
14 minutes. Y'all think of some questions. I'm probably going to get done before that 14 minutes is up. There's one third line of evidence I want you to consider with me, and that is this. His enemies had no answer for their testimony. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not trying to reverse the logic here. I recognize we are making a claim that that Jesus rose from the dead. And so it's incumbent upon us to provide compelling evidence to believe that claim. And I think we've considered a little bit of that tonight. But I wanted to throw this in simply because I think it is curious that the enemies of Jesus couldn't do this. They couldn't deny the resurrection, even though they tried to provide this alternate narrative. I want you to think back to Pentecost. The interesting thing is, you guys are working around Jerusalem in VBS this week. All this happens in Jerusalem, remember? So on Pentecost, Peter is in Jerusalem when he stands up and says, you killed him, God raised him, and we are all witnesses. Where is Jesus buried? Just outside of Jerusalem. So my question, why didn't they just go get the body? I mean, everybody knew where it was, right? This idea of going to the wrong tomb is absolutely absurd. Can we start with Joseph of Arimathea? Joseph knew where his own tomb that he had carved was. Joseph knew where it was. And the disciples knew where it was. Some of them watched him buried. The women were coming back to the tomb on the day of the resurrection to do more work on his burial process. Later, the disciples are going to come running to the tomb. They all knew where it was. So listen, the Jews knew where it was. They knew the resurrection claims. In fact, they were concerned that the disciples will try to get this resurrection myth going. They were worried about the body being stolen, and so they instructed the Romans to go and guard the tomb, which they were happy to do because they wanted to keep the peace. And so think about that. Joseph knows where it was. Jesus' followers knows where it is. The Jews know where the tomb is. The Romans know where the tomb is. Everyone knows where the tomb is. And so my question is, when this resurrection myth is started by Peter on Pentecost, I wonder how far it was to the tomb. Because I'm thinking maybe even during Peter's sermon, they had time to send some guys out there and roll away the stone and get the body. Can you imagine how that would have ruined Peter's sermon? If he's announcing Jesus rose from the dead and the high priest comes in and said, well, that's interesting. We got a body out here. Y'all need to come look at it. Why didn't they do that? Let's go get the body. Resurrection myth would have been exposed. Christianity would have died on the streets of Jerusalem. And brothers and sisters, Jesus Christ wouldn't even be a footnote in history. And all of us would be doing something different tonight. Problem is, they couldn't do it. Because there was no body. All they could do was concoct a story that the disciples stole the body, which frankly was a pretty dumb story. First of all, it's in conflict with the historical evidence, right? They don't strike me as a group of men saying, let's go rip off the body so we can start a resurrection myth. But there's another problem. Even if they were, the tomb was guarded by Roman soldiers. Galilean fishermen, Roman soldiers. How do you think that's going to come out? If they had wanted to go take the body, was it an option for them? Roman soldiers never would have allowed that to happen. It would have been a quick and easy route. Again, brothers and sisters, this was not something that happened quietly in the corner. It's happening publicly in the city of Jerusalem. That's where Jesus taught toward the end. That's where his enemies arrested him. That's where his enemies put him to death in front of the public. It was a public spectacle. They buried him in a tomb everybody knew about, and 3 days later, the body wasn't there anymore, and all these people had seen him, and all they could do is come along and say, the disciples sold the body, and we paid off some guys who would say. The message of the gospel began with that Pentecost sermon and took root in the hearts of men and spread like wildfire throughout the world because there was no body in the tomb. And people saw him alive again. What does that mean? It's true. He rose from the dead. And if that is so, brothers and sisters, then everything we believe is true. You know what it is? It's a compelling argument for the existence of God, because Jesus came to be God in the flesh. And if he rose from the dead, we know that that claim is absolutely true. That means everything that Jesus said is true. Everything Jesus taught us about Scripture is true. Everything that he taught us about covenants is true. What he said about judgment, what he said about heaven and hell, it's all true. And by the way, what he said about morality is true. And how I live my life and behave myself, that's true. And I'm going to be accountable for that. I am accountable to him. One day I'm going to answer for how I live my life, which, by the way, is the reason people don't believe. Please don't let anyone ever convince you that people are unbelievers because of the evidence. That is absolutely not so. Henry Morrison wrote an outstanding book about the resurrection years and years ago, but it didn't start out as a book about the resurrection. The book is entitled Who Moved the Stone? And his purpose originally in writing was to disprove historically the resurrection for Jesus Christ. That was his goal. And after considering the resurrection the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, Henry Morrison wrote a book called Who Moved the Stone? And the first chapter was entitled The Book That Refused to Be Written. You see, when he looked at the evidence, he became a believer. It isn't about the evidence. It's about the implications. And that is, if it's true that Jesus rose from the dead, I am accountable to him. I have to do what he says. As my coworker likes to say, he gets to start messing with my life. That's why people are unbelievers. They don't want Jesus messing with their lives. And our faith is not in vain. It's worth it to serve the Lord, because every word he has promised is going to come true. We have compelling reasons to believe that is true. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about that. How about asking questions? Perfectly easy ones. Or maybe you want to add on something that was said. Please. Thank you for jumping in, Don, and getting us started.
So, curiously, thinking, something you said made me wonder this. So this is an open-ended question, just knowing what you have in your little well of knowledge. The teaching of resurrection to a Jewish audience would have been equally surprising and miraculous, because that was not out of their experiences, although it was forecasted in prophecy. What would have been, to a Gentile world, so compelling about a risen Lord? What would have made them, we know in Acts 17, when he laughed at them. So what is it? Is it the human unifying desire to live again? What is it that would you say make that so compelling?
Well, a couple of things about that. First of all, if you were making up the story, nobody would have thought of making up the story. That's one of the reasons I think you can argue that this is true. Nobody would have concocted a story, particularly in that culture. We all live on the other side of the resurrection, so our view of this is different. If you could get in their sandals from their perspective, this would have never been the story. And even elements of the story, I will get to your question, I'm not dodging it. Even elements of the story for the culture are completely bizarre. For example, who were the very first witnesses of the resurrection? Oh, after the Roman soldiers. The women. And the ladies are saying, and? What's your point? point is, culture did not highly regard women at that time, not as God did. In fact, one of the things the Bible does is dramatically elevate the status of women, because that isn't the way it was in that culture. So if you're making up a myth about the resurrection, you would not have written, yes, and our first witnesses were women. No, it's not what you would have done. So the whole story is completely counterintuitive for what would have happened back then. However, I would really buy what you said about the resurrection speaking to the greatest human fear. And that is the fact that we are going to die. Think about the way Jesus is presented in chapter 1 of the book of Revelation. It's the one who holds the keys of death and Hades, the one that was dead and alive forevermore. It is our great problem. The fact that the clock is ticking faster and faster these days, yes? Yeah. We're the same age, by the way, so I'm totally relating to that. And Jesus comes along and says, I beat death. I've been there. I was victorious. I blazed the trail, and I will help you beat death too. Yes, I think that's a compelling story, and speaks to our greatest fear that is concerned. Great. Anybody else have a question or a comment you would add to what we considered?
I'd like to comment on the women.
On the women. Man, I was hoping I was going to blow right past that and stay out of trouble.
I have a hard time believing it's happenstance, that it just happened in that order. I think it had to have been providential to some degree. The way that everything is working, Jesus says, my time is not come, my time is not come, my time has come. And all of that understanding that everything. So why Mary? Why? The response that you read between them, I'm not trying to go to the Gospel of Thomas or anything else like that, but it's just fascinating to me the humanity of the conversation that exists in the resurrected Lord. That in vast contrast to world religious leaders, that when world religious leaders begin to develop a following, there is this sense of majesty that they feel over all the people that, and that if children come to them, and they, but when Jesus is raised from the dead, as the Lord of Lords, King of Kings, and creator of the universe, all the things that are true to be ascribed to him, he comes to Mary. And I just, to speak to that humanity, that even as a raised Lord he expressed, draws me to him. And it's probably because I'm a believer. But I mean, I'm just curious if in our evangelism, we're talking to our friends, compelling them to understand that he fulfilled all of God's purposes in being king, prophet, but he came to show us what God intended us to be. And so here he's risen. He's about to be enthroned in 40 days. And he just talks to this woman. I don't know.
So, you mentioned reading as a believer. I think we really do struggle to read the Gospels and to see the story the way they would have read the story. I think that we talk about looking at the Bible with Western eyes, and that really is a problem. So, coming back specifically, why would, and I do agree, I think it is intentional that women are these first witnesses, among the first witnesses of the resurrection, because it is so consistent with the nature of the story the gospel tells. And what I mean when I say that is, how many times are the people who are doing the right thing the people people you do not expect to be doing the right thing. Jeff and I Jeff is my coworker, did a class together a while back on Mark, and one of the themes we ran throughout the class was who's in and who's out, and how it's always the people you imagine would have been in who have no part of the kingdom, and the people who are on the outside are the ones Jesus said, that's the kind of faith I'm talking about. That's the kind of person I'm looking for. So there's that, one of my favorite stories is in Luke 7. Jesus is invited to eat in the home of a Pharisee, who you think would be in, right? Because they were, we think Pharisees, we think Matthew 23, we think hypocrite bad guys. That is not the way the people of their day would have looked at Pharisees. Pharisees were the people devoted to the law, serious about religion, and yet he's clearly the bad guy in the story. Who's the good guy in the story? The disreputable woman that breaks in to a place she's not invited and does this awkward thing. She washes his feet with her tears and her hair. The outcast from culture is the one who knows how to honor Jesus, unlike the guy you would expect. So all throughout the story, it's always the people you don't anticipate who are in. And the people you think would be the ones, they're not in. So follow that through when you read the gospel. I see some kids in the back. Do I need to stop talking? Yes, sir. Yeah, there are actually a couple of different episodes about that, and you kind of have to take them one by one. Let me just say real quickly, I'm not always sure he immediately wanted people to know who he was, like the two guys on the road to Emmaus, and don't ask me to explain what he did there or how that came down, because I don't know, but I think intentionally he was not allowing them to know who he was because he wanted to work that a little bit before he revealed himself to them. Thank y'all so much for coming tonight and having me and for your careful attention. I appreciate that. I will praise you with all of my